Good. Hi, folks. Thanks for being here. We'll just get started right at 2 p.m. We just wanted to let you in from the cold, open up the waiting room, as it were, get you settled in here. Thanks so much for being here. Maybe at this point, I'll remind my people also to mute yourselves for this beginning part. Thank you. Awesome. Alrighty, good afternoon, bonjour tout le monde et bienvenue on behalf of Concordia University's fourth space. Located on unceded Indigenous lands in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, fourth space is activated daily via live events such as this one to create engagement around the various research projects and initiatives in development across the university. So to that end, it's our pleasure to welcome all of you in, panelists and audience members, into our virtual space for the ABCs of Dramaturgical Ecologies, the first event in a series organized by a Concordia-based multidisciplinary group of artists and researchers interested in the ecologies of dramaturgical processes. Of course, I will pass it over to the event organizers in just a minute to get you situated and tell you more about this. But before doing so, I'll just mention a couple of things. Number one, as you may have already noticed, we are running this Zoomy as a meeting instead of a webinar, which means we're all on equal playing field. You'll have access to turning on your camera and raising a hand if you wanted to jump into the conversation after the first half of the event. But we are prioritizing the moderated conversation in the first bit of the event for the first 40 minutes or so. So to that end, we'll invite you to go ahead and keep your cameras off and make sure that you're muted. And then, like I say, when it's time to jump in, you know what to do. The chat, of course, is also activated. The second thing quickly mention is that we are live streaming to YouTube, and we'll be controlling that view on active speaker view so that we have that as the recorded version of this conversation. But once again, because you're in the Zoom, you can control your own view to the setting that you prefer. I'll pop the link to the YouTube channel into the chat now. And on that very happy note, it's my pleasure to welcome in Angelique Wilkie. Hi, Angelique.
Hi, Anna. Thank you very much. Thanks to everybody for being here. It is monumentous to be able to start this. I mean, it's been a good couple of months in the making. I want to thank Fourth Space, first of all, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to do this in such a wonderfully efficient hybrid, well, not hybrid, I mean, it's not as hybrid as we would have liked, fashion. I'm going to start with a full land acknowledgement. And so I'll do that first and then come back to some other details. We'd like to begin by acknowledging that Concordia University is located on unceded Indigenous lands. The Kanien'kehá:ka Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters on which we gather today. Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today it is a home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. For me, it's important to start with that, not just as a formality, but because the focus of Dramaturgical Ecologies is actually bodies in creative processes. And for me, you cannot separate bodies from where they are situated. And so on that note, I would also like you all attending to just take a moment and address for yourselves where you are and what the relationship is between your own person and the lands on which you are situated. Dramaturgical Ecologies is a research project that's funded by the federal and provincial funding agencies, as well as by Concordia University. And its initial focus, its initial curiosity, is really what I'm calling the dramaturgy of the performer. And as we have kind of plowed through that over the past 2 years with my trusty crew of amazing colleague artist researchers, rather than research assistants, we've narrowed it down in this last year of funding to looking at the relationship between Blackness and dramaturgy. And out of the Blackness and dramaturgy exchanges that we've had and conceptualizations that we've played with, we've come up with this ABCs idea, which is really looking at the movement between formulations, expressions, articulations of Blackness and dramaturgy, how those two things are in dialogue with each other, in resonance with each other, what frictions exist between them, how they manifest in different doing and thinking practices. And so it's on that basis that we have assembled the guests that we're bringing into this 5-part series. This is the first of that series. And I'm going to try and be really well behaved behind my Zoom camera, but I'm over the moon to welcome my friends and fellow thinkers and doers, Mélanie Demers and Seika Boye. And to begin this with you is an honor. So thank you for being here. And the trusty crew of elves and wizards that have made this all possible are with me. And one of them is going to be moderating this conversation, Kadi, Mello. And the rest of us will kind of step in as the conversation evolves before we open it up to questions to everybody. And I just want to say, if there's anybody who's particularly interested in the work and wants to get other information or more involved, please feel free to put your email address in the chat and we'll follow up with you afterwards. Because what I am saying is not the most important thing today. Kadi, you're on.
Thank you, Angelique. Welcome, everybody. So my name is Kadi. I'm a PhD student at the Humanities Interdisciplinary Program at Concordia, and also a collaborator to the Dramaturgical Ecologies Research Creation Group. So I'll be moderating this conversation with this, which is itself an experimentation on what else a staged dialogue can be. And by bringing some prompts around the concepts and the keywords of relationality and body as archive in relation to our today guests' practices. I'd like to remind that the prompts were generated collectively by our Dramaturgical Ecologies group. So I am myself very excited to be with you, Mélanie Demers and Seika Boye, in this proposition, and mostly grateful with your presence in this first of a series of events that Dramaturgical Ecologies is preparing through this year. And it's a very beautiful way to start with the works of our guests, because this will be about dance creation, choreographic processes, archival and curatorial processes. It is about, in our guest words, the dance that is recognizable and the dance that is not recognizable, and dance as a way to produce different point of views on a story. If I can somehow describe what I got to know so far about the work that both Mélanie and Seika do in a sentence, I would describe it as a work that, while it is being created, it activates a community of people, Canadians, trans-Canadians, artists, social dance artists, contemporary performing and visual artists, and the artists who were before us, for dance was and is fugitivity. So my wish is that this conversation can spark the richness of Mélanie's and Seika's work in their specificity their complexities, and the way in which of them relate. For relation, in the Martinican philosopher Edouard Glissant terms, is what connects elements without living outside each of the small differences that makes relation. So with no further ado, let me introduce our guest. Welcome, Mélanie. Welcome, Seika. So Mélanie is a multidisciplinary artist. In Montreal, she founded her own dance company, MAYDAY, in 2007, exploring the powerful link between the poetical and the political. Les Angles Morts, Sense of Self, Junkyard Paradise, and Goodbye have all been created from this perspective. With MAYDAY Remix, she deepened her engagement with cross-genre works in hybrid forms. Her fascination with the interplay between word and gesture crystallized with Wood, which won the Calc Prize for Best Choreography. In 2016, Mélanie Demers began a new creation cycle with Animal Triste and Icon Pop, both works touring internationally. In 2017, Mélanie Demers was invited to work as a guest choreographer at the Blackness Dance Theater in Malmö, Sweden, for the creation of Something About Wilderness. Now that Dance Mutant has hit the stage and Confession Publique, Cabaret Noir is about to enter into spotlight. To date, she choreographed over 30 works and was presented across Europe, America, Africa, and Asia. Thank you, Mélanie, for being with us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Seika is a scholar, writer, educator, and artist whose practices revolve around dance and movement. She's an assistant professor, teaching, stream, and director, Institute for Dance Studies at the Center for Drama, Theater, and Performance Studies, University of Toronto. From 1995 to 2010, Seika performed and presented her choreography across Canada. She danced professionally with Ballet Créole, Electric Company Theatre, Judith Marcus Project, and many independent artists. Most recently, Seika has worked as a movement dramaturg with artists including Natasha Powell, Hola Jazz, Cyrita Hector, Mix Dance Collective, Diana Bowen, Heidi Struas, Adele Hyde Dance, Research Choreographic Intensive, and Janet Sears. Invested in movement histories and the archive, Seika's research explores Blackness and dancing in Canada and embodied learning and pedagogy. She curated the archival exhibition It's About Time, Dancing Black in Canada, 1900-1970, and co-curated Into the Life, Eugenics and Education in Southern Ontario. Welcome, Seika.
Thank you, Kadi. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. So to start our conversation, I would maybe bring this word relationality. And my question to introduce both of your work to the audience would be, what is the work you are making in different spheres related to? Or simply put, what does your work presently relate to?
Go ahead, Mélanie.
I was about to say, who's going to start that?
I'll take another one first.
So I guess it's a very simple question, but also like a very broad question in terms of thinking dramaturgy and thinking Blackness. What does my work is related to? I'd say very honestly, it's related to my own chaos, to mysteries of the world. It's related to my mess. It's related to failures and cravings and scars and traumas and I don't know, identities and quests for freedom. So I would start with like throwing throwing everything all out. And then I'd say, of course, my work as an artist is my work as a citizen. My work as an artist is my work as a mother. So like everything is connected, interconnected. So I'd say my work is in relation to the world and to my community and my communities, and in relation and related to my family and to myself, and then to, you know, like a spiritual connection in, you know, like the best times. So, you know, like I would think it as, you know, like it's a some sort of a circle that goes like closer and closer and closer to an absolute. This is how I would start the conversation.
Thank you, Melanie. Seika.
Thanks, Melanie. That's beautiful. And I love your offering of chaos. And I would start to right now, I think I'm preparing to write and spend a year or more doing some writing. And my work oscillates between being very active and embodied in studio with others, doing archival research, teaching. And it's been a while since I really sat down and wrote for a long period of time. And so I think I'm coming into relationship with a certain part of myself, and less and less as I get older, less and less as my work integrates what were previously separated out practices, you know, this practice of reading and writing, this practice of dancing, this practice of teaching, the practice of motherhood, which is it can't be left out. And I recognize, and when I look back, I listen to things talk about more and more and more as part of my practice. My kids are 9 and 14. And so there's that aspect. I also teach. And so my relationship to teaching, to students, to colleagues, to the idea of offering something to be learned, but also the reciprocity of learning. So reciprocity, relationship, land and gardens and plants. I am also in relationship to how we have shifted over these past 2 years, going back to teaching in person. I felt a shift. And so I'm thinking about those, you know, you mentioned, Melanie, this getting closer and closer and closer. I often talk about the concentric circles of practice and what happens with different impacts. And so I'm thinking about how this time that we are still in has shifted my practice and shifted understanding. And I think, you know, it's one of the things I want to talk about later, but an experience I had in going back. And so being in relationship to how we are changing, always, I think that is a question I'm always asking, and how our understanding, I'm a historian, how our understandings, evolving understandings, emerging understandings of histories alter our understandings of ourselves as we move forward. I'll end there.
So, but how would you describe your work? You know, like, what is your work? What do you do? You wake up in the morning and what do you do?
So many things. I mean, I wake up and I care for others a lot. Care is a huge part of my work. I teach, I research and I write. I am in conversation a lot, and I spend a tremendous amount of time reading. I mean, those are my practices. That is what I do. And I think, I walk and I think. I walk every day. I walk as far as I can in a day, sometimes twice a day. And I do a lot of thinking. My work is thinking and formulating ideas to communicate in different ways, whether that be through writing, whether that be through dramaturgical practices with people, which I've been doing less over the last 8 or 9 months, really, for a variety of reasons, in part because I'm preparing to write. I need to clear my slate of other things and other people's projects. And I collaborate a lot. I work on projects with others and work on facilitating opportunities. So thanks for that question. Those are the tangible things that I do. Yeah.
Beautiful. So I think going from relation and trying to go around this idea of relationality, I would like to ask to you, Seika, to talk a bit about your work, this living dancer, where you engage with the self-archive and the shared archival simulation installation. So it kind of approaches a bit this idea of body as archive. Let's see how we come up with this idea, but also it is a relation. It's a relation with archive. It is a relation with your experience of archiving your own objects. So also it's a work where that helps to see relation between archives, the present, the people, and also how it relates to privacy somehow.
Yeah, thanks, Kadi. So this Living Dancer was a project that came out of an artist residency at the Art Gallery of Ontario in 2018-19. It's a 9-month residency. And I had, I finished my PhD in 2016-17 in that academic year. And then I curated It's About Time Dance in Black in Canada, which was based on my dissertation. And in my dissertation, I look at it's historiographic. So it started as these case studies of different organizations, and it became historiographic and asking questions about how do we tell histories of Blackness? How do we do research? How do we look in archives? How do we look for things that appear not to be there? That's a way that I talk about my practice too, is looking for things that appear not to be there. And some of the residue of that experience, and there are many residues of doing a PhD, but kind of an intellectual and emotional residue was this idea that I had been mining through archives looking for Blackness. And it while there were many rewards and it was so generative and many things came out of that, it also felt the word predatory is coming to mind, but you're really digging and looking for something, and you're also looking through private things as you do that, and you are, sometimes you're fortunate enough to connect a living human being to something that you find in an archive, but many times you don't have that access. And so I really thought deeply as I was doing my writing, and continue to, about how we tell histories of Blackness without invading privacy, without this necessity of telling the private that we have not been permitted to tell. And I'm a very private person. And so in thinking about this, when I was offered this residency, I thought, oh, geez, what am I gonna do? I don't know, I don't really dance around anymore, and that I don't perform. I had left performing, sometime before I started my PhD. I'm not a visual artist, and so I really wanted to take this opportunity to ask questions about institutions, archives, museums, galleries, and self-determination. And so I decided to turn those questions on myself. What can I figure out about privacy if through archiving myself? And so it became a self-archiving project. I showed up in this, dry studio that I was sharing with Sandra Brewster, phenomenal visual artist who many here likely know of, with my things that were documents of my dancing life. And I worked with the contemporary art conservator, Sherry Phillips, and she taught me conservation practices as they are enacted in art galleries. And I also worked with the AGO archivist, Amy Furness. And so it was learning from them about their practices in order to think about how I might adapt them to suit how I felt I needed to archive myself, what needs to be adapted and shifted. And so I built over time a container for my archive, which was determined by the professional practices of how things need to be treated in order to last as long as they can, need to be conserved. And I did that, I built the sextile rack, and maybe I can show a photo later on. And I wrote my own finding aid. So for those of you who have not worked in archives, when you go into an archive and you ask for a fund or a collection, you're given a finding aid, and that finding aid is a guide to what's in that collection. But that finding aid has been created by the archivist. It's not created by the person if the phone is, if it is titled as a human being. And so I created this finding aid without offering any private details about myself. And I invited people into my archive and to use the finding aid, and they had a set of instructions, and they had to wear white gloves, and there were always 2 people at a time, and often they didn't know one another. And I left them in that room for 45 minutes, and they had to follow these instructions. Ange was a visitor. And they went through the archive and they filled out a number of questions, and questions like, what do you wish there had been more of here? And for example, I didn't have any photographs of myself dancing because I only included things that I really felt represented my experience of a dancing life. And for anyone who dances, there are so few photos that document our dancing life that actually connect to what it means to us to dance. And so I wanted, and I didn't include journals. I didn't include, they were objects. And so I was really interested in people's interest in my archive. What is it? And what were there's sort of a data collected from that. And I'm just going into offering this methodology now. So I'm pausing and thinking about it because I'm thinking a lot about this. It's been 3 years since I stopped, and now I'm going back to it. But the objects that were of most interest to people often were the ones that were kind of the most distant to me. They were important, but they weren't the most significant. And so I have those questions about how we encounter the archive of others, and how the remoteness of that engagement and that experience. The other part of my residency, though, was inviting Natasha Powell in to give me a lesson in Lindy Hop once a week for a series of 6 weeks. And she was teaching me something that I didn't know, and I wanted to learn something new and a practice. And she's very invested in the history of the dances she choreographs and makes and learns and teaches. And so that other body as archive exploration was, what does it mean to learn from someone? Because when we're training and learning as younger dancers, and I'm in my mid 40s now, and it's been 15 years since I trained on a regular basis. I don't think we're thinking about how profound that go in every single day and learn with people and learn from someone and what it is we're taking on through that practice. And so those are some of the tentacles and that describes the project. I'll end there. Thanks, Kadu.
You're talking about this process of learning something new, and that makes me think one of the refrains that keeps coming back in our dramaturgical ecologies group is the questioning of around this idea of the body as a neutral canvas in dance, in performance, and how this is related somehow to some sort of privilege, who gets to be neutral. So that's related somehow to this idea of body as archive, as okay, what is it that the body is archiving? Who gets to archive? Who doesn't get to archive? And how does that resonate with your work? I think I should tell the audience to come and check your other exhibition, It's About Time, where you are working with archives around social dance from 1900 to the 70s, where you are also inviting a community of artists in response to that work. So it's a form of activating the archive that you bring. So yeah, what about that idea of body as a neutral canvas? How and its relation to your work with the archive?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, neutral is a word I don't use in my practice or my teaching, I think is how I would say it. It is a privilege, and neutrality in relationship to different aesthetic practices and modes of learning. I studied ballet, jazz, tap, musical theater. My professional career was in modern and postmodern dance. And so I encountered this idea of, if I was in postmodern dances, and this conversation has been had, many times recently, but it continues to be important to have. But this idea that, you're not a racialized body if you're doing this work, that it is only form. There is no narrative. You are neutral. You are free. This was kind of this idea that was proposed to me, and it's a really appealing idea. I mean, because it is something that there, in me at least, there was a longing to be released from a type and a stereotype and all of those things. But of course, the promise makes the reality of it all that much harsher as you come to realize it over time and you come to age. And I think that the way I would relate it back to this idea of mining archives for Blackness is also that this idea of neutrality, or this idea of encountering ephemera, or when we, and this comes right back to dramaturgy and Blackness and these overlaps, that we can't you cannot make assumptions, of course, but it is also it's so delicate. I mean, that's the word that I would use. And again, remote. I mean, it isn't there for you. And that's what I think about archives, and that's it. And so also Bardia's archive. And I presented on, there's this photo that I found once, and there's this little black girl. She's in a lineup with 5 other white girls, and they're pointing their toes, and the teacher is there, and she looks very happy. And this was an outstanding photo to find because there weren't a lot of pictures of Black dancers in this context. And I just remember encountering that photo and thinking, this photo isn't here for me. And so I might impose all of these things that were her experience of being the only Black girl in this class. But what about her design? What about the thing that took her to that class? And so, you know, neutral canvas. What excited me coming out of my research about Black dance in Canada and activating communities and asking people to respond to archive, but going into dramaturgical practice is going into dramaturgical practice with other Black artists. And Blackness may not be theme, but we start the work from somewhere else because there are conversations that don't necessarily need to be had. And so it can be about coming to the work more directly. And that doesn't mean there aren't, you know, so many differences, to come back to the, you know, relationality and universality and in what you've shared here, Louison. But it, as a Black dramaturg and as someone who considers Blackness and dramaturgy, the offerings are different depending on the relationship, right? And I think there's in Body as Archive, and part of my work in activating community and part of my work in research is oral history interviews. And I was thinking a lot about this in watching the work and Mélanie. And Lynn Abrams is someone who's written a lot about oral history and work in oral history, and this idea that the stories we tell at present are our current resolution of our life's conflicts. And the details of the story may change the next time we tell them, because in that moment we have a different resolution of that conflict. And so that is true with the stories we tell, and so it is true with the, you know, the body that shares it and how the body communicates it. I'll end there. If I've answered the question at all.
Thank you, Seika. Well, I think somehow in the same way, Mélanie, thinking this idea of, okay, body, neutral canvas, in somehow relation to body as archive. In your practice as a choreographer, what do you think that the body is archiving, or what choreography is about in relation to this archive that the body brings in different registers? Like on the piece that you shared with us, you say that for me, dance is a way to expand the body archive.
I think if we're talking about dramaturgy, and then I position myself as a choreographer, not as a performer necessarily. So my work is to actually make people move. And I have like all sorts of different strategies to, you know, like to start the engine. And digging into the archives or digging into the history, identity, and past traumas and memory is for me a way of doing that. I don't know if it's ethical to do that. You know, like some might think that it's very, you know, like not fashionable these days. But it's a way that I have to actually, you know, like bring to light what is, you know, like ingrained in the body. So I would say like in the archive, and I would say for me, like it's in the fibers, you know, like, and if we would think of, you know, like a body as a neutral machine, then we would all move the same. But we are not, because we come with our limitations and we come with our history and stories, and that is where I think art is to, you know, like dig in that. So you used, Seika, you used the word delicate, and I'm going to use it too, because you know, like my work is to make people move, as I said before. sometimes I think like it would be like so much easier if I'd be a writer, because like whatever I would do, I wouldn't hurt people. Like if I would invent I don't know, like a traumatic situation, I could do it with my characters and no one would be hurt. But because I work with live art, I work with people, then I'm walking on minefields all the time, and I guess I have a talent for that, like to make like to make things blow. So I think that's where it's delicate, because I'm not only working with my own archives, I'm working with other people's archives. And then I'm, like always like, I don't know, it's like swimming in mysteries, So I think that's what is fascinating. That's what is interesting in working with other people, in working with otherness, like the concept of, like not putting yourself on stage, but actually like putting your own fantasies and utopias and desires and quests, but being embodied by other people. So this meeting is where dramaturgy happens for me. And then if we talk about Blackness in particular, then it's interesting because my Blackness, or my experience of Blackness, is being filtered through other people that sometimes are Black, sometimes aren't Black. So it's as if like, I wouldn't use like neutral canvas, but I would use like some sort of a vector, because like my fantasies and desires go through like someone else's vectors, and then like our two colors mix, and it creates like something that is not exactly me and that is not exactly them. And this is like the beauty of art, of a meeting, of collaboration. And it's messy and it's muddy and it's dangerous and it's delicate and it's beautiful, like all of that happens in the meeting. So to go back to your question of archives, I think I once said that archives are, like what is archived in the body is like what you can't escape. You cannot escape your identity. You cannot escape your memories. You cannot escape necessarily your traumas and your scars and stuff like that. But you can look at them like under different light. Like my understanding of my own identity shifted. Like it wasn't the same when I was a teenager that it is now. Like as you said, Seika, and then I relate to that. Like the promise of universality is so appealing. Like you want to forget about your Blackness, or you want to forget about womanhood, or you want to forget about, like a part of your identity. And sometimes you want to claim it and reclaim it, like you want to wear it like a coat, and, like you wear like t-shirt like that, and you wear, and you're like, Black is beautiful. And then you put it at the forefront, and then it becomes like, and then you're like creating and recreating your identity. You're actually performing, like your own identity. And the same thing with memory, like you put things aside and sometimes it, it brings you back, like sometimes like, you forget that you've been, like used and abused. And sometimes it's at the forefront. It becomes, like what you play with. And same thing with trauma. So, like what is being archived in the body is also like being filtered through social movement, because like I feel like we live in an era where we put identity at the forefront. It wasn't the same when I was like a teenager. Like I would never describe myself as a Black person when I was 14. Like I would want to forget about that, like now I do. And I think it's because, like the era changed, and then the way that we interact with those issues change. So I think it's unseizable, like, and that's why art is interesting, because like it's always like trying to find and define humanity, our condition.
Mhm. sharing. I think that also somehow, I don't know if it would resonate for you, Seika, with the work that you do between archival practice and the activation of a community of artists that respond to the archive, as we see in It's About Time. Even though we are using this term body as archive, it also, as in conversations in our Dramaturgical Ecologies group, there is this idea that there is something that escapes the archive. There is something that the archive cannot capture, and how to activate that fugitivity that is already embedded in the archival work. And I think you show a very interesting and beautiful way of doing that, that is through the inviting a community of artists in response to the archives that you're bringing, that somehow it's activating something that the archives cannot represent.
Absolutely. And I'll come back to this word vector that you used, Mélanie. And next to that, I just wrote down where are we beginning? So when I teach, standing in neutral or be neutral or neutral face or neutral whatever, it's all over the place. Neutral was just thrown everywhere in my training. And so I had to stop using that. I made a choice to stop using it. I unlearned using it. I had many reasons. I saw it, my work in the archive was, someone said to me once, what did you learn in researching Black dance in Canada? And I said, well, I learned about the creation of the Canadian nation state and, the decimation and genocide and all the, that's what I learned. I went and asked a question about dance, and here's this thing I learned. This massive truth through the documents, through policy, through description of, shifts in immigration legislation, through the genocide of Indigenous peoples. You see it there. And so it changed me. I changed my practices. I had to, one day, one decision, one choice, all of those things at a time, had to shift that. The choice wasn't leave this thing, this practice, this art that is me. It is part of how I define, and it's part of how I understand myself. It's not how I define it, it's how I understand myself as through someone who has trained and danced with other people for my entire life. But I have made changes to teach differently from how I learned. And so in place of neutral, I started asking, where are we beginning now? Where are we meeting each other today? Where, what is your personal awareness of yourself right now and in relationship to these other people, and let's move together now. Because I don't train dancers, I teach movement for actors, which is a whole other, panel, but a real shift from thinking about dance to thinking about movement and why we move and why we want to learn and what do I know from moving with other people. And so in inviting artists to respond to the archives that I've accumulated in asking about dance, it became so important that other people interpreted these materials I found, because they are not my interpretation of them, right? They're an invitation to think about something. They're an offering to know. And so, on the website, you see the visual artworks that come from there, which are, works of the imagination. We see, I did oral histories with Ashley Perez and Shel Moss, and those were manifested differently. And so it's this idea of letting go, like, this is not mine. I may have done this research and I built this exhibition with other people. Thanks, Kadi, for sharing that there, but it will only continue to expand in meaning through other people. I mean, and through them learning a history that we hadn't being offered. And for dancers and people, who dance, to learn of dancing in different locations that they can relate to directly is profound. And that reconsideration of themselves in relationship to those new understandings of local histories, of the histories of their families, is, that's where the exciting work is for me now. Do I want to go back into art? Sure, that's part of what I do, but it is talking to other people about what it means to them and finding ways to share that. I guess that's an expansion of archive, in ephemera, right? It's like I just saw this artwork, and I should find the name of the artist, of someone who carves wood that looks like pixelations. It's a Taiwanese artist, so beautiful. But that just came to mind because it's, these archival objects that we find are so, delicate is a word I've used, but they're not static, they're not fixed, they're not any of those things. And so what other people see is wonderful, important.
Can I dive in quickly just to
please
up on something? The Seika, you've just been talking about, the fact that you in a way, the objects that you brought into the space, having experienced it as well, that echo is there for me, that it only becomes activated through other people. And Mélanie, you just talked about your experiences of your Blackness actually being filtered through other vectors.
Yeah.
There's something similar in that experience. And I'm interested in you, both of you ultimately, but I'll start with Mel, just helping us think through, how does that resonate? In what way does it, that whatever experience of Blackness is filtered that way, what comes back to you? How is your experience of your Blackness affected or changed by those other vectors?
I think I have to go back to my personal story. Being a mixed race kid raised by a white mother, I never really felt legitimate either as a Black person or as a white person. So you learn to try to fit in. And then later on in life, you learn to try to be exceptional and original and not to fit in. So I think it just shapes how, a kid mind's work. But the idea of defining yourself through belonging is not something that I experienced so much because just because of that, personal history. And then I think that it affects how I work because, and you know that, Angelique, very well, I am interested in my work in how other people affect your choices. So I will create platforms where the performers need to make decisions all the time related to the others. And it is very difficult for people to do that because as dancers, we are trained to think of our body and then to control our bodies. And the way that I work is to actually release that control and then give it to other people. So that I think horizontally, I always put people in processes, or I put them in situations where they have to make and remake decisions all the time, but not based on their desires necessarily, but based on, a sound, based on a decision of someone else, based on the energy or the audience. So I think that I think that it helped me to think horizontally in a way, to always see the world through that lens. And later on to make it more vertical. So I always talk about the crossed awareness like to have like a horizontal awareness, to have a vertical awareness of yourself in the world, of your position in the world, but also at the same time being able to read the room and read the world, So I think this is how I think that, like presence work, like when you have like this cross awareness, or charisma works for me when you have this cross awareness, or justesse, la justesse works when you have that. So this is a way that I guess, explored, or, like a niche that I created to understand how I work. And then this discomfort, I shared with my colleagues, and they're happy. They're happy to experience that with me.
Or at least you hope so.
Or at least I hope so.
And Seika, in your case, the moving through those filters, how does that change? What does that change about your own perspectives?
Yeah, I think early on in the research, prior to taking on this project for my PhD, where were Black people dancing in Canada? I kind of did everything I could not to talk about Blackness. Blackness is not a theme of my work. I didn't, I think in my writing and reading, it was always very present. I originally went to school for journalism. I missed dancing. I went back to dancing. So, I was a double major in literary theory and dance. So I always had this thing, but this idea of thinking about and considering Blackness was not present in my dance training or dancing life. And so when I brought that into my research and made this choice to do it, and it became the center of everything, as I made my discoveries, the first thing I felt was very validated in how frustrated and angry and, irritated and bored I was. I mean, really, though I would use all of those words with, with the way people did or didn't relate to or acknowledge Blackness in dancing life. But now the way that it comes back, I mean, the first thing I really can think about is my relationships to students in the classroom environments that I hope to create. And that, as Mélanie has said, we didn't come up with this thinking and with this language and with this openness and with this awareness. I was also raised by a white mom from New Zealand, no less. I mean, she didn't see a Black person until she was 16, right? Like these are serious realities about your perspective and how you're formed, but observe the world. But you also know, and I'm trying to think, there's a beautiful quote by Zadie Smith, and I can't find it. It's, it's somewhere in my computer here. But this, you have a very early awareness that this certainty that people can be so adept at presenting as, this is this and how it should be, it's a lie, it's a fabrication, it's a performance. And so it's you now, that is a more kind of generative, exciting, and fun place to engage. And I'm excited when it becomes fun and playful and generous. I mean, there so much generosity can come from that shared understanding, as opposed to, fear or denial or oblivion. I think that's what excites me. And how it informs. I look for that. I try to create conditions for that, I think.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I'm also just to go back to what Seika was saying about like the anger that you discover that you have, that you didn't know that you had. It's beautiful, like when you release it, because like we've all felt that. I was like, oh my God, yes. I can relate to that. And I think, like the experience of Blackness in Canada is that oftentimes you're the exception, and then you become a symbol, like you're not your own self, like you're just like a representation of a concept. And then I'm learning, like late in my life, I'm learning that I have to learn about my history, and then I have to share that common experience with other people, so that I am not the representation of Blackness, but like it's not a monolithic block. It's rich and it's complex, and sometimes it contradicts, and that's the beauty of it. So like to have like plural voices, I guess that's what I want to mean. Like we have to have plural voices to understand the complexity of what it is. And this, of course, like in life, but on stage too,
Absolutely. And in parenting, a huge part of my decision to launch into this project was, I did so when my oldest son, who's now 14, was around 2.5. And I was definitely related to, how do I talk about myself? How do I, in order to tell him about himself. And because my parents, my father was from Ghana, West Africa, my mom was from New Zealand, and they came here in the late 1960s. And so their ability to talk about Canada and Canadian history, period, and then Black history in Canada, which wasn't really available or talked about, was so limited. And so there's something that can come later in life. But I also remember the playfulness. And I was thinking about this this morning when I was reading through some of your prompts, Kadi. And I remember being in the grocery store with my mom and getting old enough, around 11 or 12. And, she would be putting through the groceries and I would be there. And so often a cashier I'd be kind of standing close, say, "Can I help you?" And then I would say, "Oh no, I'm just helping my mom." And then my mom would laugh. We would laugh. We would have this shared joke of them not recognizing us as mother and daughter. And it became, and it only grew from there. I mean, my mom is a Kiwi and her humor is wry and wicked. And we had so much fun and pleasure within that. Because even if she couldn't understand Blackness, we had a shared understanding of not being recognized as of each other. Mm-hmm. And so that, I think, is where that, that sense and that desire for a playfulness to come from those moments and ways of being and received. And, I want to say spectated, but that's not the word, but thinking about spectatorship, being watched and looked at and interpreted.
Well, with those amazing sharings, thank you, Seika and Mélanie, for sharing. I propose we could transition to questions from the audience. And if people have questions, they can actually raise their hand and make themselves appear and make themselves the questions, or write some questions in the chat. We can read the questions as people feel more comfortable.
Can I ask a first one? Well, second, I guess. In both your practices, and I recognize it from my own as well, because of course not everybody knows that, but I come from contemporary dance, European contemporary concert dance. And with all, with the whole, baggage that brings. And I'm interested in, you both mentioned this, being watched, being seen, being not seen, and navigating certain fugitivity, it's kind of that we're constantly juggling in all kinds of different contexts between hypervisibility and invisibility. Sometimes we seek one and then the other, and sometimes it is imposed on us. And I'm interested in terms of your practices, how that resonates with you, how it might manifest if it does.
Well, Angélique, it's so well put. You just like summed it all up. Yeah, what more can you add? Do you have like something to add, Seika?
Not much. I mean, a word came to mind, and then I was fixated on it, which was refusal. You know, all of these mini refusals I had, but that kind of turned me a couple of degrees this way, and it made me nimble. But I think just like visibility and hypervisibility, you can become very nimble or very tangled. So I would say that observation. And then visibility. I had something else, but I've forgotten. I'll come back to it. But I agree. I mean, it's so well put. And oh, I know. When I'm working with artists as a dramaturg, something that I start my questions, because the practice is just so much, you know, it's questions, asking questions and asking new questions and asking another question. I'll often start with what's not on the table for you. What doesn't get to become a part of this performance? And the more revealing the performance is set out to be, the more important that question becomes, is what's not on the table. And then we can throw everything else in this pile. And that is definitely, you know, an intersection of Blackness and dramaturgy. You're laughing, Ange, like it's so profoundly. What doesn't this work get of you? What aren't you giving of yourself to the work, to the public, to whoever? What are you going to put in this little box over here that is going to remain yours, even though you're going to share all of this? Yeah, that's a starting place for me. And when it becomes compromised in the process, then it's, you know, maybe it becomes a part of the work, and it doesn't mean it can't, but there's a big conversation there, you know, what shifted it? If these conditions are changing when we put this thing in the box over here, because you said you wanted to, you know, you being whoever. Yeah, that came out of that dance, of that nimbleness and that tangle. Because as you're going through it, there's a moment at which you realize things are happening in the studio in relationship to your race, and you recognize it in the moment it's happening, instead of going home with like a bad feeling and it takes 3 months or 2 years or, you know, a decade to realize, oh, but there is a moment where you start to recognize it as it is happening. And I think that's a shift. I think there's something there that happens and allows you to make decisions differently in the moment.
I think for me, I'd say, you know, like moving between hyper visibility and invisibility, I'd say like there is another pole that I feel sometimes with, which is like hypersensibility or sensitivity and total numbness. You're like, I think I have like a few examples where, you know, like sometimes you don't know if you're hurt for the good reason. You know, like you don't know the reason why you're hurt, you know, like, and is it because of a race related issue or not? I remember once I was like, I was in Berlin, like coming out of a dance studio, and then there's a car that passed through, by me, and then they just like threw ice cream, and then I received ice cream, you know, like on me. And for a reason or another, I thought, you know, this is like a race attack, you know, like this is a racist attack. But I couldn't prove it, or it was just like, if it's random or if it's, you know, like on point, you will never know. So this question mark for me happens all the time, you know, like in processes, in conversations, in refusals, in, you know, like, so not knowing why. It becomes part of your story. So it becomes eventually part of the dramaturgy.
Well, Seems like we have a question. Would you like to unmute yourself, Ezzy? Sorry, I hope I speak your name correctly.
Okay, AC.
AC, okay.
And, hi, ladies. How are you? I just want to say first, thank you for giving space for this conversation. It's really, 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 really appreciated. The question that I have for both of you, I do dramaturgy as well within my own work with a strong spiritual base. And so my question for you both is, when did you realize you were arriving? Like at a place where you felt like you felt strong in the things that you learned, the things that you gained, the things that you took off your plate to say, okay, this feels like my practice. This feels like who I want to be. This is a good sponge of information to really feel like I can move forward.
Seika.
Yeah, I'm nodding and laughing because I think there have been different times where I've had that recognition, and I think they've been about shifting focus. But what's happened is I've shifted focus over time is that I've brought more of myself into each shift or allowed things to be integrated. And that's something I love about dramaturgy is my practices collided there. They do collide there. And my knowledge is activated and challenged. And it just feels exciting. And like there are unknowns that I don't know exactly where it's going. I don't like to know exactly where things are going. I just like get restless. It makes things easy, but I think that's what I came to recognize is when lots of parts of myself feel like they're firing. That feels great because in a way it is a dance. It is to come back to this recognizable and things that are recognized in the dance as a dance and things that aren't recognized as a dance. To be firing like this, it is like doing the most wonderful combination of, when you're just going, and you're, all of these oppositions are happening at once, and it is the best feeling. That firing of the mind that feels good to me because it reminds me of doing dancing is, I guess, is part of recognition, and I'm using this as an example because it's outside of, affirmation through being offered jobs or making enough money or doing those things. I mean, those are real things, but this is about a different experience, I think, and dramaturgy at the intersection of and informed by Blackness does that.
I think on my side, I'd say the question is, when did you know you were arrived? I was like, never. You never know. You don't know. And the more I, I gain experience, the less I know. It feels like each time I enter a new creative process, I have more fears of getting lost, and also like more excitement to get lost, because when you get lost, you find things that you had never thought of. So I think the experience gives me this desire for, walking in the forest. For me, like creation is really like entering a forest and getting lost in it, and hopefully like find my way with my people, and we get all intact, and in terms of dramaturgy, I am not a dramaturg myself. I use the immense talent of Angelique Wilkie. So, you know, like I create and then she comes in the studio and then she bombards me with all sorts of questions and then I cry and then we start all over again. So that's how it goes, you know. So no, you know, like you never arrived. But you find confidence in this state of not knowing or unknowing.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you both. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks for your question, AC.
Thanks, AC. Yeah, there's another question. So I was going to jump in with one other thought. Vanessa, can I? And then I'll take yours. It's really, and maybe it's just something to think about. By no means a truth, but just from my own experience of my dramaturgical practice as well, and the questions that I'm sitting with that have generated these conversations in any case, is really that through my dramaturgical practice, I find myself exploring a practice of Blackness. And that's another layer that is emerging, and it is also emerging relatively late in my life as well. So, you know, for all kinds of reasons, very much related to, you know, the social situation, being a mother, etc. But seeking to not identify or define, but to discover my practice of Blackness, or the practice of Blackness that emerges through my dramaturgy. You know, I mean, and when I say dramaturgy, I don't mean my personal dramaturgy, that's part of it, but really my work as a dramaturg, and how much, in fact, the two things are interrelated. Yeah, I just wanted to add that.
Thank you. Thank you, Angelique.
Vane.
Well, first of all, I wanted to thank you for your speeches, your contributions, and this amazing dialogue. I was just thinking about this image that you brought, Mélanie, of getting lost in a forest and finding your way through it, which you do through encounters. And I was thinking about how it might relate as well to Seika's experience of working in archives, for losing yourself in all these objects and the encounters that they create, and how you get out of the archive changed, or how this informs your practice. And also this brings me to another word that we didn't think of before, which is the repertoire, and how does this interplay between the archive and the repertoire, and repertoire as setting the archive in motion, but also as a set of performances that are all the time performed by somebody else, sometimes maybe. So also that work in relation to others. Is this idea of a repertoire maybe a setting in motion of the archive, coming across the unknown?
It's an interesting question, because this word repertoire, you know, like for my practice, you know, like I'm always in conflict with repertoire, because I'm a choreographer of contemporary dance, so I have the arrogance of thinking that I'm always going to create something new and groundbreaking and whatever, you know, like those words that they use to describe and sell a work. The idea of my own repertoire and the idea of like a body of work that is not mine, that I am in conversation with, is interesting. So I don't really think so much about what I created in the past, because I'm so excited about what I'm doing in the present and what I will do in the future. So this is like something that perhaps I cut my roots a little bit from myself, but at the same time, the repertoire of others, I feel like I'm always like in constant conversation. You know, like sometimes I will have like conversations with, you know, like great directors that I have, that I admire. They don't know that I talk with them. You know, like Castellucci doesn't know that I'm in conversation with him, but my work is in dialogue with him all the time. Or writers that I I admire. They, of course, they don't know, and they totally ignore who I am. But in a way, like putting my work in contact with them makes some sort of a conversation, and it creates like a history or a repertoire in a way of conversations or of prompts or of a platform to like jump from. Nice question. Thank you.
Yeah, just to objects and archives and getting lost. Absolutely. I mean, it is because I go there to then write about them. So for me, the writing practice and figuring out how to incorporate them into something written is really, and as a scholar, after I finished my dissertation and I wrote this very particular type of work, met the needs of a dissertation, fulfills the requirements of a PhD, it says on the title page. I really had a strong desire to write about all of those things in a different voice that didn't necessarily fulfill the requirements of a PhD, but they fulfill the requirements of something else. Mm-hmm. And part of that is about access. But yeah, it is getting lost and it's figuring out how to decide. And it's also, for me, a terrifying place, to go and have to contend with a whole new set of materials. I remember making a trip to Montreal to the Negro Community Center collection that's housed at Concordia. And just coming out of there and feeling sick. I mean, I think I got a migraine because it was so much. It was so, it was almost too disorienting because it did, again, like this, I think of this activation all the time, your brain just laying up. But yeah, it's a great comparison. Thank you. And repertoire, I mean, for me, in a way, the exhibition has become, I wanted to invite people to respond to it because it's like the exhibition itself becomes reiterated, and that's a practice that comes from dancing and dance making, and collaboration is inviting people to interpret something that you have offered. And it just felt like it was time. It was starting to feel lonely.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
We also have another question in the chat that I will read from Mayra. Hey, Mayra, how do you relate with the pain that this conversation experiences provoke in the skin sensibility? For me, I can't do my question here with my voice because I will just cry and my body shakes, all of it. For me, as a choreographer, dancer, thinker from indigenous yet separated background in Mexico, these sensibilities create so much pain in the body that I have to find ways of diversion from the pain, instead refusal, fugitivity. Kind of how the schizoanalytic, differently from the psychoanalytic, which attempts to work with the problem and then rebrings the painful experience. The schizoanalytic for me, in terms of going toward invention and techniques or attunement to operative tools. For example, the making of a day, invention of a story. The question simply is, what are your techniques that you find out in the way to deal with pain that these intersections bring to the surface? Mm-hmm. Thank you for the question, Maya.
Thanks, Maya. This is a big question. And I want to start with acknowledging the pain that is present in, that soaks this conversation. And we've talked about it in many perspectives, but I do want to acknowledge that. And techniques, I don't know if I have techniques or solutions, but certainly the people I create or collaborate or in dialogue with, is critical, as not so that more pain isn't generated. And I think that in my teaching, I hope to offer a way of thinking about ways of being together in our complexities, and non-verbally, teaching movement to actors. One of the first things I developed in my pedagogy was, non-verbal problem solving. So what is it that moving has to offer in terms of thinking about how to be together, that we don't get to practice very much in a society that is obsessed with talking and words. And so I don't know that it's a solution or a technique, but it's an offering. That is about discovery and, awareness of self, but also an awareness of self that is constantly, and this brings us right back around, I think, in flux based on who we are in relation to. Yeah, I hope that answers in some way, or acknowledges at least.
I think that, I don't know if I understand the question well, but it's definitely not a technique that I have. And for this reason, I wouldn't, I wouldn't advise that to anybody, but I feel like for me, the way that I have to deal with my pain is to transform any of the trauma and into a scar. So like the way that I do that is that I use it and create art material, so use the privilege of having a creative process to transform and heal from there, without making it a therapy, because it's not. So I think that would be my answer, just like acknowledging the fact that, depending on different processes and depending on your colleagues and depending on, like how it's created, sometimes you have the privilege of digging in very deep and find a way to put it in, a dance phrase or a poem or whatever, and then this heals you. And hopefully, it just creates some sort of a catharsis, and other people recognize themselves into your pain. And then, that's what art is.
Yeah, Mélanie, it's I so often in introducing myself to new classes and students, because cohorts, sometimes you're teaching cohorts for 2-3 years in a row, so they get to know you. Those first introductions a lot will happen here because we're working and moving together and not talking. But I'm not a physiotherapist, I'm not a therapist, I'm not a doctor. Those are things that I've learned to state very plainly, because the experience of moving together is profound. The things you discover through moving are profound. The things you make with movement are profound. And they, there are things there to discover that aren't through words. But yeah, like you say, it's not a therapy. And if you're lucky, though, something happens and transforms, right? That's yeah.
If I can add one thing that comes to mind for me is just the opportunity that is offered in a creative context to engage our realities or with fiction, and what becomes transformative is also that weaving of reality and fiction, and how by engaging our realities with our fictions that we propose, that we generate, how they are actually transformative for the reality you know, the facts don't change, but the way we engage with those facts changes quite significantly.
Yes.
Again, I don't know if that's a technique, but it's more an observation of what my own experience has been, and also what I've witnessed for others.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think those encounters are and leaving ourselves the space,
Yeah,
to allow our fiction making to be.
mm-hmm.
Yes, I mean, Matthew has just written into the chat, this is closer to fabulation than narrative. Yes, I think so. But I think that fabulation is important. It's part of it is part of the transformation. It is part of the healing. It's you know, as Thea Hartman talks about, it's also the gaps in our realities and in our histories, the things we don't know, and we fill them in.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a healing place when we can fill that in, you know.
I love that the fact that we engage with fiction, and this fiction transforms reality and eventually has an impact on, you know, the world. I love this cycle. Beautiful.
Mhm.
So well put.
Maybe we have the time for one more thought, if there is one, because it's 3:30. I know that people have afternoons, although this is a great way to spend one.
Well, I don't know if I can do that, Melanie, if you authorize me, but if I can read just a tiny quote of the writing that you shared.
Sure.
Where you say that in a creative process, I shut myself up with amazing people, and we tell each other all about our marks, our scars, our wounds. We make a big bonfire out of them. We tell each other how we have burned in the most empathetic and narcissistic ways. We become vector. We become other. Maybe that's the only thing that lets our wounds close. Performance functioning as the most beautiful scar of all. Thank you for offering that.
Thank you.
Well written, Mélanie Demers.
Thank you.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
On that note, not sure what protocols there are. If people are interested in following other conversations, we'll make sure that we send them out. We'll continue to publicize the other 4 to come. Thank you all enormously for being here. And Mélanie, Seika, Kadi, gratitude.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody, and thanks so much for joining us. Those of you we can't see, we feel you though. We appreciate you being here. Other folks who watched on YouTube as well. Once again, I'll send around an email with the link. There was so much interest in this conversation. We had like almost 100 people register, and of course, then you know, things take over. But luckily, we have the power of the recording, so you can revisit these words. So thank you so much for allowing us to share your thoughts in this way. We look forward to bringing you back into the space next time, and hopefully a hybrid version of the next time.
Hybrid.
All right, folks, we're going to close up the Zoom on this note. Thanks for blowing up the chat with the thank yous. We appreciate it. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye. Bye.
Much love.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yay.